His Excellency José Gregorio de Faria, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Portugal to NATO, and Major General Wolfgang H. Schade, German Military Representative to NATO, spoke before the Council on April 27, 1992 at the World Trade Center. The title of the address is NATO and the New World Order, the European Perspective. Introducing the speaker is Mrs. Sheila K. Riggs, President, Diversified Health Services Incorporated, and co-chair of the Board of Trustees, the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs.
His Excellency José Gregorio de Faria serves as the permanent representative of Portugal to NATO and also as president of Eurogroup, which consists of the defense ministers of European governments to NATO. He has had a distinguished diplomatic career, which includes a stint as ambassador to Ireland in the early 80s and another as Portugal's Director General for European Economic Affairs. In 1986, he served as Director General for Political Affairs as well. Major General Wolfgang Schade's background is as distinguished on the military side as Ambassador de Faria's is on the diplomatic and economic sides. The General has been a member of the Armed Forces since 1957. He has served as Chief of Personnel Planning, Commissioner for Armed Forces Personnel, and more recently as Chief of the Planning Staff. He was recently named Chief of Staff of the General Army Office. American observers have a number of questions with respect to NATO at present and in the future. What will its role be in dealing with any residual threats? What might its out-of-area role be, if any? How will it define the boundaries of its activities? What role will NATO have in the political evolution of Europe? What role will the United States have in NATO going forward? And of course, finally, the practical question of the size and composition of NATO, given the military situation both in Europe and in the world at large. So we have much to look forward to this evening, and I think we can do it with pleasure. We'll be interested to hear the insights of both our distinguished guests, and I understand that Ambassador de Faria will begin. Mr. Ambassador?
Ms. Sheila was so kind that, in fact, she introduced me in so kind words, which, in fact, I didn't recognize myself straight away. A bit like in this old story of that lady who was crossing the street. When she was called by the police officer who called her, he said, "Lady, look, that beautiful Rolls Royce is yours?" And she said, "No," smiling. "No, but what a nice idea you had, sir." I think in any case it's good of you to have addressed these words. We are ready to NATO, and we are extremely gratified to see, starting this tour in the United States, that our allies in this side of the Atlantic remain as faithful, as engaged, as committed as ever in the alliance. The audience we have here today, and it's a great surprise for us, I would say a beautiful surprise for us, is in fact a token that NATO exists, the alliance is adapting, new times, new difficulties, but in any case we are managing, and that you trust us and the work we are doing in Brussels on behalf of all. The Eurogroup, you have already, Mrs. Briggs, said what it is an informal group of European countries who in fact tried some years ago to establish this informal group to have a special contact with the United States, in a way to bring what we feel, and particularly to come to listen and to see how the Americans feel and react to our common problems. In fact, it's a two-way street, and when we come to talk and not to make long speeches. This is a talk, inevitably a bit probably longer than usual, but I will try to be as short as possible, passing the message, which is, after all, a complex one, because we are in a time of change, on a time of radical move, and despite some critics, I think that, in fact, we have managed well. At least we didn't lose much time. The Americans were very, very, very important today. They are recalled as being really decisive to the rebuilding of Europe after the Second World War. There was a First World War in which, in fact, we were quite unsuccessfully in keeping peace. It was a short one, as you know. I think that the Americans grasped well then the second time, and in fact, all the structure which was built, from the Marshall Plan until NATO, and all, including the creation of the EC and the common market, which in fact are also a creation of the United States and of the efforts among Europeans in the United States. All this, in fact, made Europe more economically and militarily integrated, that is to say, and this is the problem always in Europe, less dependent of nationalisms. I think that now we have to realize that the Second World War is over. And another war is also over, the Cold War. Also, and then we know how glad and how satisfied and happy we were all, just the time to realize that in fact the context is a bit more difficult and complex than it seems. Therefore, NATO as a context keeps the partnership, the openness, the mutual respect, which is the rule basic of our organization, and I think she is absolutely updated in this respect to face the new international order. An order which is emerging with difficulties, where you, United States and Americans, have the great responsibility of being now the major and I would say unique superpower. It's a big responsibility, and we want to share that at least to the extent that we can help you. The military power is very important, but it's probably no more as essential as it was in the past. The security has new dimensions, as you know, and every country has internal problems, serious problems, of development, of competition, of environment, of sort, and of course we have to pay tribute to those who in fact are, who pay the bill, and in fact the electors are those who pay the bill every time. And the politicians and the policy in general has to take that into account. The regional conflicts, of course, are now more frequent, possibly. The European identity is gaining a new dimension, at least is trying to assume its duties as a community which aims towards supranationality, which in fact was basically the idea when it was created. The United States have and are a natural part of that identity. NATO, in fact, is the European defense. It was so 40 years ago, it's still today, and we want that NATO will continue to be the European defense, adjusted, and we'll see how it has to be, because indeed the collapse of the communism, the end of the Cold War, the victory of the liberalism ideas, and as even some more optimists felt, the end of history, I think that we have in fact to very much look now for what is the beginning of this new period. The 20th century, some say, started at the end of the First World War. Others say now that the end of the Cold War was the end of the 20th century. We are probably already in the 21st century. A 21st century with plenty of difficulties, because we have still countries with nuclear capabilities. We have the control of those nuclear weapons, which is a problem, the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We have the separatisms, the regionalism, the ethnic, and the border tensions. We know all now about that. And the economic difficulties. Sometimes even the chaos is not very far. So there are requirements, very stringent, very difficult for assistance and cooperation. And I believe that the agenda of NATO is large, is essentially important in this agenda. We have to pass to partnership and cooperation with those countries where, in fact, our former adversaries. From confrontation now we are coming, and very quickly, to partnership and cooperation. We have to control the problem of the arms proliferation. We have to try to look and keep a close eye over the regional disputes. We have to build, because we have really to build new mechanisms for crisis management and for avoidance of crises. And at the end, we have to keep what we have been until now, that is to say, a solid alliance, keeping deterrence and defense, because every country every independent country has as a national duty its own defense, and we have decided 14 years ago to keep our defense in common. And I think that the integrated structure of NATO, what we learn, what we have, is really important. Having said that, I wonder, in fact, whether we can really still wonder that NATO has still reason to exist. Many doubt, and I think that we feel that we could really address quickly three main questions. I will try to be brief because when we start speaking then it is a bit more difficult. But I will concentrate in these three questions, that is to say, is really a need for the continuity of the alliance? What does the alliance today? Because many are wondering what we are doing today. And finally, what can we do to answer the new international conditions? Because many answer and many pertinent questions can be raised in this respect. Taking the first question, I would say we have reasons to continue, at least starting by the beginning, for what I could call our passive assets. We are a political organized community which was built in values and principles, and these principles and values were not totally dependent or exclusively dependent on the Soviet Union threat. In fact, the alliance was more, it was also because of the threat. It was much more than that. It was a commonality of interests and a commonality of values, where we have still the framework to develop on a beneficial manner our transatlantic relationship. We have common experiences and a common political culture, and this is very important. Europeans and Americans share the very same political culture. And if we see and we look from the inventory of what we have an organization working, probably the only one working today well. We have doctrines, we have procedures, we have practices, we have infrastructures. We spent a lot of money during 40 years to build infrastructures in common. They are still there, and they can be used. We have military assets, command, control, communications, intelligence, air defense, sea lift, logistics support. All this was tested in the Gulf crisis. Many have said NATO was absent in the Gulf crisis. It's not completely true. In fact, we followed the line of discussion, but in fact, everything which was then successful in the Gulf was very much a product of NATO. It was because we had the training of our armed forces, and these diversified groups of troops who arrived in the Gulf were controlled by the common procedures existing in NATO. We had, in fact, the training of consultation. It was the intensive consultation, discreet, but very intensive during all the crises, that in fact allowed the success at the end. It was the military capability and the ability to use the instruments either in the Mediterranean or in the Gulf, or even really on the ground, that allowed the success, which was also very much based in the command and control systems existing among us. So I think that NATO is still needed, and this is my thesis, needed for long and short-term stability. Stability is today the core of security, we know. And NATO has to renew on the continuity, and we are doing that. We'll come to that in your questions if you wish. It's still indispensable for the global order. We have to organize the requirements of security with caution, because in fact nobody can predict the future. Usually the crisis, a surprise, as some have said, surprise is the permanent factor in security. We call the Falklands, the Gulf, the 20th degree, the Soviet Union, last August, and so on. So I believe that when we make the reassessment of the US-European relations, we can really confirm that we have common assets, those who are embodied in the alliance, values, principles, interests, and experiences. We have common concerns today, those who come from the problems I mentioned of the proliferation or the management of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the need to rebuild Central Europe, the new challenge of out of area, as Mrs. Briefly called us. We have to preserve and improve our economic ties, which sometimes have difficult periods. They always have difficult periods. We all succeed to solve them. We have to play in the cooperation with the former adversaries different roles, and we have to discuss that peacefully in a good spirit of alliance membership. And therefore, I think that we have also to address our own fears. That is to say, the Europeans, as you know, always had the eternal problem of nationalisms. The Americans also have a scene of sometimes having some feelings of isolationism. We have together to fight both, either the nationalisms of the Europeans or the sometimes isolationist trends. In seeing you, I can say immediately that isolation in the United States doesn't exist. It's simply a state of mood from one day or another. Anyhow, it's true that the European architecture is building according to the plans of a union, a political union. Therefore, security is a problem in this respect. Defense is another. And I would say that defense of Europe is NATO, will continue to be NATO. What we have to do, what we are trying to do, is to strengthen what we call the European pillar of NATO. This has aroused sometimes lots of problems. We'll come to that in the discussion, I'm sure. But I can confirm you that, in fact, what is being done, and General Schade certainly will be very able to do that, is being done with NATO. That is to say, it's not against NATO, is a way of strengthening NATO in some way to rebalance the alliance to the extent that the Americans have and need to leave, although leaving sufficient number of forces and presence to maintain the leadership position they have had in the past. There are new organizations. They are always having an identity crisis. In fact, all the new organizations were built for a period which was the Cold War. Now they have to revise them. The CSE, the cooperation, the security and cooperation in Europe, passed from 30 members now to almost 50 members. And they have really problems to cope with that. WEU is, of course, an instrument Europeans are using to strengthen the European pillar. This raises problems with associate members who are not members of the WEU and are members of NATO. We have absence of infrastructures, intelligence and logistics, so the connection, the association with NATO is almost indispensable because NATO still remains the pivotal element in the security. And only it can provide a viable defense. The basic decisions have been taken since '89 in London. The heads of state launched the program to really what they call to change and to move to extend the end of friendship to the former adversaries and to pass from the antagonism to the cooperation. And now we have really built new instruments, and we are working very closely, almost daily, with the Polish, the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Lithuanians, the Russians, they come less frequently, I must say, the Kazakhstans, but they are coming too, the Ukrainians. So they are all coming and they are starting discussing with us very frankly. We are not giving them formal guarantees of security, legal, but we are really working in a way and saying at least that their security is for us a main concern, and nothing which will happen to them will be without meaning in our behavior. Therefore, I believe that we are in the right track. The next C, as it is called, the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, is a reality, and we can really, through this means, I think, protect and preserve the peace dividends, move forward in the arms control, and face new challenges as they might arrive. Saying that the alliance is now renewed, it is being tested. It's a new test. We are really at the very beginning. Everything is new, and we have to adapt every day. We cannot today say, as in the past, that we built forever, and that things were existing were for lasting lot of years. Now we have to be prepared to revise, to adopt, to adjust, to correct, because we are building things new and changing and facing a changing reality every day. Therefore, this second reconstruction of Europe, the one of the East, in which we are now engaged, I think that the alliance will show the ability to transform itself from a defensive political organization to a political defense organization. The nuance is still somewhat important. And we have to build necessarily a European pillar in conjunction of interests and partnership with the Americans, because we have to accept that the reductions, namely in the US forces, will be somewhat important. We'll continue to cooperate, and we are very much able to be pragmatic and realistic. The status quo, I don't believe you can really honor the status quo. We are in a time of change. And if you trust us, the work we are doing and cannot be produced the results immediately, I would say that they will come, and at the end, the renewed alliance will be an adapted one, and at the end, at a very low price. And I will stop here because I've been already too long. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I also thank you for this welcome, and may I say you that I am really happy and proud that I have the chance to talk for this distinguished audience. It's the first time in my life that I am in Baltimore. I am not the national military representative in NATO, as it is said in your paper. I am not an insider of Brussels. I have been, as it was said, for 2.5 years, the head of the planning staff of the Minister of Defense. That is a very small group only working for the Minister of Defense. And when I started in this assignment in October '89, Honecker was celebrating his fourth anniversary. The Hungarians opened the border, and we had a lot of refugees from East Germany. And '90, one of my first tasks was to deal with the 2+4 task. And in November '90, we had the German unification. And let me say to you, we had this unification because the American people helped and assisted us. And without this help, we wouldn't have this. Everybody in Germany and Europe is aware of the situation. And we had the London summit with a new keyword for the NATO strategy, that is cooperation, as it was mentioned by Mr. Ambassador. And since November '91, and sometimes we have to look at the months, what happened in Europe, because every month was an historical date. And since November '91, we have a new NATO strategy. And that's also very seldom that NATO came up so quickly with such a good paper. And what is the background of this NATO strategy? As you know, the big threat is gone. However, many risks, a lot of crises based on ethnic, religious, economic, and political problems came up. Middle East, proliferation, nuclear problems were mentioned. Ladies and gentlemen, we have war in Europe, in Yugoslavia. You can watch it every day. And all European countries, especially the new democracies, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, they are asking for more security. And NATO has always been the stable factor for European security. I will not add anything more because it was mentioned by Mr. Ambassador. And I was 3 weeks ago in Poland. The Polish feel threatened by the Ukrainians, by the Lithuanians, and especially by the Russians. You know, in this Kaliningrad area is one army, and this army is not supported. They don't have food, they don't have fuel. They are running around and looking where they can get it from. And that is a threat. And the Polish are our neighbors in Central Europe. So that is the situation, very briefly marked. What are the essentials of the new or the improved NATO strategy? NATO will continue the basic element in European security structures. Whatever the structures may be that come out from discussions, what can United Nations do, what might come up from SCE, how will develop European community with WEU. These are all organizations helpful, necessary, but the stable factor, ladies and gentlemen, has been NATO and will be NATO. And there's no doubt about it, not with the French people. The strategy will improve, as it was mentioned, the European pillar. We don't know exactly how, but there are discussions on. We will come later on to details. This strategy will improve the capabilities for crisis management in peace, in crisis, and in war. And let me say, the transatlantic relations and a vital and essential US component is necessary and is stabilizing NATO in Europe. And in this strategic concept, the liaison concept of NATO is installed, and we are starting with all the partners of the eastern countries, as it was mentioned. And on the background of this strategic outline, we have now two new documents: the Military Directive for Military Implementation of the Alliance Strategy concept, and we have also NATO force structure for the mid-90s and beyond. And we are building up this force structure, and the main points are that we will have further on a basic organization. We will have main defense forces, not so many present as it was in the past. It's not necessary, especially not for the European countries who are based on a conscript system. And we will have crisis and reaction forces. And the key words for this grouping is more multinationality and more flexibility. In the past, we had, for instance, in the central region, 9 army corps. In future, we will have 6 multinational ones and 1 national. This 1 national is the German ones in the eastern, in the new countries as we call it, because it is a result of the 2+4 speeches and results that we will not have assigned forces in the new Länder until the end of 1904. And we will have similar constructions in the Air Force and in the Navy. Let me please touch the German-French relation. I was very often asked about the German-French initiative, and some persons were confused about this. Again, Mr. Ambassador explained us that so many things are not fixed. We are looking for the best structure for European security and defense. And one point that's also a part of the NATO strategy is to strengthen the European pillar. And how to do this? And the Germans and the French started some initiatives in the past concerning the European community. And I think I can say it that a lot of things that were brought on the way in the European community came from German, French initiatives. And sometimes people didn't like it first, but then they lived with the situation. And the initiative to build up a German, French, and then a European corps was started last October. And also in Germany and in France, some persons were surprised by this proposal. However, it is another corps with European nations to strengthen European security. And there is nothing fixed, or there has been nothing fixed up to now. It is the initiative, and we are working on this. And the idea is that this corps also will work in the framework of NATO, in the strategic of NATO. But there might be in the future different possibilities how to act with military power. And therefore, WU might be organization who can handle also military power. And that is a second point where the French and the Germans believe with the other NATO partners who want to share that we can do some military work in the WU. Nobody knows exactly how it will work, but it's an idea. And the third one is to work with this European corps on humanitarian basis, as we did in the past very often in the Balkan area and in helping for Kurds. So that is the idea. And there is no doubt about that we will have not a separate organization. Command, control, communication, all these things can only be used from the NATO side, because nobody has money to in Europe to establish another organization, a double organization. So the only thing we think about at this time is that we may have two planning staffs, one for NATO, concerning all the NATO problems that should rule in NATO, and another one on WU basis. But that is an idea, nothing more. And may I say this as a German, that will bring, this initiative will bring the French a little bit more closer to NATO on the military side. And looking at the history of these two countries in Europe, I think it is the best result after the World War II that these two nations have become friends, and really close friends. And if you have had a chance to travel there, then you can feel that there is no hostessness between. They are friends together now. And friendship, especially in terms of security and defense, needs sometimes symbols. And a very good symbol was the German-French brigade. We have been living now with this brigade 4 or 5 years. And now Mr. Mitterrand, Mr. Kohl thought the initiative for this European Corps could be another very good symbol for European security and defense. So I should end now my part.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. The floor is now open for questions. I'll repeat the questions for the benefit of the audience and the television camera. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned that the nuance would be on political leadership rather than military leadership, with military leadership following behind. Do you foresee a role for NATO in initiating resolutions in the United Nations in the future, taking the lead, leading the charge, and helping to enforce them should the United Nations accept your suggestions and enact those resolutions?
The question is, given the emphasis which you state will be placed upon political resolutions in future NATO, in the future definition of NATO, do you anticipate that NATO will participate in helping to enforce UN resolutions?
I think that the answer is given, was already given. If we take the example of the Gulf, because it's the most recent one, what do you see, or what we will see there? We see the United Nations calling, resolutions of United Nations calling for the number of troops to be involved in the restoration of order and peace in Kuwait. It's to say, a UN nations, United Nations operation in which there were NATO, where WEU was also present, and therefore there was a combined movement of United Nations, WEU and NATO. WEU, the Western European Union, had a number of ships in the Gulf, mine hunters if I'm not mistaken, and also in the Mediterranean. NATO was present in full in the Mediterranean, in Turkey, with 3 wings, I think, of fighters and the Patriots. And as I have remembered a while ago, all the logistic support, all the structures of command and control, all the intelligence service made by the OAX was made by NATO. And, of course, the operation, the full operation, was conducted under the United Nations aegis. So, this is an example how things are today moving. We have to realize that the threat of the past has disappeared. Fine. And in fact, this was a unifying factor. We all felt the same threat. And therefore, the tendency normally, naturally, was to react also in the same way, since the threat was the same. Now that there are different risks, different kind of situations, we have to admit that there are some different perceptions. And this is why, in fact, we are now trying to prepare NATO for more flexibility, for rapid reaction first, for what we call all-weather situations. We cannot really say or anticipate that the situations will be that, or the other. What we have is to prepare our structures, lighter structures, much more reduced in number, of course, in degree of readiness and all that, but still able to act rapidly if need be. And this is also a second step is coming, not yet, but it's emerging in this spirit of flexibility. The structures of the alliance and of military structure, and the General Schade will probably, certainly better than I define and explain that, but what I can say is that we are really walking towards something which will be, instead of the push from the bottom situation, which was the past situation. In fact, one article of the alliance is the Article 5, everybody knows, if one member was attacked, all the other had to respond. And it was, in fact, the situation of all for one, one for all. Now, of course, we are moving to some kind of what some are already calling the coalition of wills. Because it might be that some have a more political perception or more economic idea that the problems, let's take the other border of the Mediterranean, will be solved in Algeria or in Libya or whatever it is, can be solved by other instruments so far. Others might feel not. It depends. But when a situation, a dangerous situation emerges, we should have the instruments to quickly decide how we can react. It is to say we cannot stop paralyzed by the lack of unanimity. And this is the problem. And I think this more or less answers the question so far we are in our proceedings. Thank you.
Yeah. Perhaps we should add one sentence. NATO is a defense organization, and it is limited to a defined area at this time. And the 16 members, they may decide what they want to do. So NATO helped a lot in the Gulf area, all the nations from NATO, but NATO as organization was not involved. So we have to be very careful if we talk about the NATO as organization is involved. And that is, the discussions are going on. Should NATO take over other tasks? And all persons are asking for that because it's the only organization that works. All the others do not work. And from my point of view, the 16 nations, they have to come to an agreement because that is an organization of 16, and then they can take over other tasks, and they have to talk with the United Nations or with the other organizations. That process is going on, as the ambassador mentioned.
Yes, sir, on the far side of the room.
I wonder, during the Persian Gulf, it became apparent that a number of German countries or companies had supplied technology of mass destruction to Iraq. What, if anything, is the German government doing to sanction them, and what, if any, innovations or procedures are in place to prevent that from happening in the future?
The question is, how is the German government dealing with the phenomenon of certain German companies having supplied military technology to Iraq?
It's a very difficult question because this question can be raised to every country. As far as I am informed, the Germans assisted, but there are other nations, and I think the Americans too, they gave a lot more than the Americans. But I do not have details.
Yes, sir.
Is the membership of NATO fixed at 16 for the foreseeable future? And if not, what are the conditions that any prospective members must adhere to in order to join NATO?
The question is the NATO membership fixed at 16? And if not, what conditions must be met for prospective members?
Yes, this is a quite intensive debate this question has raised. I might probably take 1 minute more to come back a bit. No, there is no magic number on the 16. We are 16 so far, and we feel it's good to keep 16 so far. And we have all the understanding that NATO has to evolve, and that we have to meet the problems of those countries who are today very much dependent on the stability of NATO, and therefore for themselves need somewhat protection of NATO. How to achieve that is the problem. One solution would be to simply say, very well, bring them in. And I would ask, would you be satisfied with that? And yes, why? Because I have some questions about that. And one question, of course, is that the costs of enlarging membership would represent also that you have to assume the responsibilities of protecting and defending those countries where they are until their own border. And if we are giving guarantees, formal legal guarantees of membership to all of them, if they get involved one against the other, and you know there are tensions on the borders among some of them, let's say Transylvania between Romanians and Hungarians, which side will take NATO? Or in Moldova and Ukraine, or and so on and so forth. So I think it's a very serious decision. The decision is not closed. It's not a file which is closed. No, no, it's completely open. We foresee very easily that we can evolve in a future which we cannot predict tomorrow, after tomorrow, to have in some countries. In fact, what we called variable geometry, it's a kind of jargon very much used sometimes in international, when we don't know very well what it means, we say variable geometry. Well, I am tending to believe that we are exactly in a situation of variable geometry. That is to say, that we cannot take all those countries as a bulk, as a group, which they didn't constitute, in fact. They are very different, they have different problems, different way of reacting to many evolutions, and therefore what we have to do is to try to meet the requirements of each one, to help them. And it might be very well that tomorrow Czechoslovakia or Hungary or Poland might join NATO if we are able to tell them, yes, you come and you are assured, you have the guarantee that we can go and that we have the means to go there. Otherwise, what we have to do is to cooperate what we are doing now. What we are doing is to intervene in what we call crisis avoidance, that is to say, to prevent the crisis and to try to be as effective as possible. In fact, we are in a totally new world. The nationalities are a problem, as we know, old in Europe. It's in fact self-explosive. When it started, we cannot stop it. The day the Germans decide to unify and the others have succeeded, we cannot say you yes, you no. I mean, it's a concept, after all, open. And very much open. But of course this brings many problems. And we see the situation in Yugoslavia, where it is. Where we are trying to avoid, I would say, to avoid the worst, not the bad. The bad is there, and probably it will go on yet. But we have so far with little means, and to try to circumvene, to control the situation somewhat. It's a brilliant solution. No, it isn't. But the fact is that when we have a United Nations machinery which is necessarily heavy, because of course it's very expensive. The United Nations blue helmets are called everywhere, from Cambodia to Cyprus, from Cyprus to Somalia, from Somalia to I don't know where, everywhere, and one day we don't know what we can do more with the blue helmets. So it's an operation which has to be controlled, but it's a very slow process. And in fact, since the beginning of the crisis until the arrival now, when they start arriving in Yugoslavia, many things happened. If you take the CSE, the Conference on Security and Defense in Europe, the Helsinki process, so-called, well, they were exactly at the moment when everybody was joining the CSE. And I mentioned that from 34 they became 50, and they had no instrument to deal with the crisis of Yugoslavia. In fact, the Europeans sent a small peace group of 200 people, monitoring people, who are there trying to control and to bring people to the table of negotiation. And how often they came to the negotiation table, how often they say yes and they agree, and how often, you know all, when they leave, they start fighting again immediately after they have signed the paper saying that they will stop. What can we do against that? So this is the situation. I mean, I think that we can accuse, it's not really a process to try to make a kind of self-inflicting ourselves all the weaknesses, all the faults, all the mistakes, when in fact we are dealing with extremely complex issues. We are developing that. CSE is now gaining new instruments. It's gaining, and in fact the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh seems to be evolving so far a bit better than before. So we cannot really have ideal solutions, but we can try to confine the problems and to try to let them at least live, or not to spread more than it is possible. And this is in fact what I would answer to come to the 16. Tomorrow you will see the NACC evolving. We are now a lot. Many probably will leave. I admit Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and some of the most Asian republics of the former Soviet Union probably will not be interested. I don't know. I'm anticipating, but the most important will come, and they are now opening with us a process of cooperation. And I can assure you, it's extremely, I would say, even surrealistic to see where our former adversaries now sitting, and it's almost a curiosity. It's a joke. It's not a joke. Occupying the office of the security of NATO now. Yeah. The security has to leave, to give the place to the offices, to the Kazakhstan, to the Ukraine, to the Belarus, because they are coming frequently, every week, to talk with us. And they are becoming much more disciplined. They are taking much more initiatives. They are knowing what they want. So the process was slow in Rome when the heads of state in Rome, November last, decided to create this new body. But now we are trying to find the areas where we can converge in an effective assistance and cooperation without overlapping too much with others. Because, of course, the problem is also that others are also interested, and sometimes there are, as it is true, some overlappings. But I would say that better having some overlappings than have vacuum in institutional situations like this.
Yeah. May I add one sentence, please? Naxi was mentioned, and I think it's very well said, that is a form and a forum where all these countries from the former Soviet Union can come and ask for advice. But my personal view is that we should come very soon to a kind of association with Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary to stabilize these young democracies. From my point of view, it's a big difference between these three countries and the countries of the former Soviet Union. These are not democracies. They do not know where to get at, but these new democracies, they need stabilization. I had to talk with them very often on different levels, and that is only my personal feeling.
Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me, maybe I'm just ignorant. I want to ask you, you said that the NATO was to defend the first purpose of the 16 nations. Now, if there is no USSR, whom are you defending them from? That's one. And the second question, you said the future problem, the present problems are economic and political. Is NATO able to change to economic and political problems instead of the military, which obviously they don't need at present?
They need.
Would you answer two questions? The first question is, with the diminution of the ending of the Soviet threat, is there still a justification for NATO? Against whom is NATO defending? And the second question is, how difficult will it be for NATO to make an evolution into being a political and economic instrument?
Yes, as far as I am informed, NATO was founded to keep the Russians out and the Americans in and the Germans down. That is a long time ago. And lady, you are right, there is no threat from the East. And the previous reason for NATO is gone. But as we have learned, in terms of security, we need security organizations, defense organizations. And NATO is a very good one. Why shouldn't we continue? The risks and the crises are other ones. We have to look how to organize, how to meet all these problems that are coming up. Very short answer, hopefully it's enough.
But the UN and the Economic Council are doing something too, so you triplicate things.
NATO has always been not only a military organization that was more seen than the others. It's also an organization for improve the culture and political things, a lot of things.
UN doesn't do it.
Can I add a word? No. No, on the first part, I entirely agree with General, of course. Defend and deterrence is a sovereign right. Every nation has the right to have its own defense. not necessarily because there is a visible enemy or a visible adversary. What the advantage of NATO is in this respect is that we have together maintain our organization. We don't need to renationalize defenses. This is what I was trying to say. We are trying to avoid renationalized defense policies. And the fact that the threat has disappeared is not a reason to keep our common assets, as I tried to say, and that we can, instead of spending alone in defense for each country, that we remain organized in NATO and cooperating with some kind of division of labor, as it is the case now. So the defense and deterrence has nothing dramatic more than to say that the defense prerogatives of every country in NATO are solved because we have a common structure, a common military structure which we want to preserve, reduced in scale, reduced in numbers, in readiness, and so on, but still what we need together. The economic and political aspect. You might be surprised to know that NATO was very much in the beginning of research in an area which in those days in 48, 49, 50 were not yet fashionable, was environment. And in fact, NATO developed quite a substantial knowledge and expertise in what we, in our jargon, called the third dimension. So NATO today is, in the economic, let's say, more or less economic field, is an expert, if I may say so, in one particular area, the area of environment, for instance, and scientific research. And we are getting together experts, scientists from everywhere in the world who come, who join, who meet in NATO, what we call the scientific committee, or the committee of the challenge of modern society, and all what we called challenge of modern society are discussed in NATO. You can imagine the interest of these works of NATO for those countries who have tremendous environmental problems, for instance, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Russia, and elsewhere. But it's true that the assets of NATO are limited in the economic field. What we do, of course, is more specialized in our own area, and the area where I said that they still need some careful attention on defense and military aspects is because they really don't know what democracy means in defense terms. They don't know what democracy is in the organization of the armed forces. They don't know very much, and they don't have clear ideas about the interplay between the civilian power and military power. And therefore, we are now building programs and working with them on defense policy and management, planning, training, budget. They don't know also very much what budget is. The policy of the communists was, we need something, you make something. The cost, we don't know. I mean, they don't have really this idea, which in the liberal societies is always implicit, if not explicitly present, of how much costs one unit. So we have to develop with them military strategies, the strategies of defense, and not, as it was the past for most of them, some kind of more fighting, if I may say so, strategies.